So, as this description Bobby read uh, just expressed, uh, what's helpful for me when things are difficult is to remember that many things are possible in any given moment. And even when we think only one thing is happening, like suffering or misfortune, that experience is organic, whatever is arising, and it's capable of being composted and transformed, sometimes much more quickly than we think, or in ways that we can't imagine. Right in the midst of something very intense and challenging. So, joy and suffering, peace and anxiety, um, they can turn into each other uh, surprisingly quickly. They are all impermanent. We could also see them as two sides of the same coin. They inter-are. So this is from Tai, who writes, "We shouldn't be afraid of suffering. We should be afraid of only one thing, and that is not knowing how to deal with our suffering. Handling our suffering is an art. If we know how to suffer, we suffer much less, and we're no longer afraid of being overwhelmed by the suffering inside. The energy of mindfulness helps us recognize, acknowledge, and embrace the presence of the suffering, which can already bring some calm and relief." So I was going to lead a group with a dear friend recently, and a session of it, like a 90-minute session. And just before, a few hours before, as we were planning, there was a conflict that arose, and there were upset feelings, and it was very bad timing. We were just supposed to lead something together, and luckily, we talked about it. We talked about what was painful, and that helped. But the feelings were still on edge. Luckily, we had planned to join another meditation that was also being led by someone else before our event. And so we joined that meditation, and it was very helpful, very helpful. It was exactly what we both needed to zoom out from that really intense experience, to widen out and take in other things that could nourish us. And the ship of our friendship had sort of struggling in the waves, and that meditation helped the ship right itself and come back into balance. And we were able to offer something beautiful in that next session, which we wouldn't have necessarily believed was possible, right, in the moment of the conflict. But those experiences of being upset, of being in conflict, they're very mutable if we stay with this practice of being with the suffering, not being afraid of it, not identifying with it, letting it take us over, but just practicing with it, letting it make its journey through us, right? And then what we were able to offer was very helpful to the people who joined us. So two sides of the same coin, right? Suffering and well-being, right there. That suffering was probably added something that got transformed. It probably added something to our offering, right? And when I look at what's happening in the world as well, another example of how suffering and awakening are interwoven. If we look back at 2022, so much suffering has come about because of the war in Ukraine. We know there are wars in many places causing a great deal of suffering. And particularly the war in Ukraine has had a very widespread impact on the world, financially, politically, in many ways. So not just affecting the people of Ukraine and Russia, but these shockwaves have rippled around the world in terms of inflation and mounting food and energy insecurity. But the flip side of this suffering, maybe the silver lining in the dark clouds of this war, are that nations are waking up to the need to invest in renewable energy that's local, that's clean, that's reliable, that allows for financial independence from forces that are weaponizing fossil fuels and holding economies hostage. So some very beautiful and surprising news was reported in the New York Times that renewables are set to overtake coal by early 2025. So renewable energies will outpace coal consumption by early 2025, which is way earlier than people predicted before the Ukraine war, right? So that's another just example of how suffering can really bring about awakening. So what this practice of taking in the bigger picture does is it shows us that even when things are very stressful, we have choices about where we put our energy. The beautiful reading, I think, that Bobby read at the beginning of the sitting meditation about seeing both the oppressed and the oppressor as victims, right? Like in these so many instances of violence just this week that have come out, right? The mass shootings and the horrible videos of the police officers beating Tyre Nichols in Memphis. We still have a choice when these horrible realities come into our world of where to put our energy. We can fall into despair. We can get angry. All these things are natural and very human responses to so much suffering. And we can also bring in our practice of I'm part of this society that is so ill, that's giving rise to so much suffering. And I'm also part of this society that has all the conditions for healing already in it, right? We were made for these times. That is Clarissa Pinkola Estes' wisdom for us. That we've been training, our practice is to help us right in this moment meet this exact constellation of complexity, right? And so, how do we see everyone involved in these horrible situations as a victim, as caught by ignorance, caught by systems and structures of power that have crushed something in them, that lead them to crush other people so inhumanely, right? So all of us are co-responsible. That is Thay's insight. When something like this happens, all of us, we all have some part to play in this phenomena. And we all can be part of responding to heal at the root in our society, in our culture, why these acts of violence continue to happen over and over and over again. Because we are co-responsible, we have the capacity to make an impact. So we have choices when things are difficult. We can turn towards the difficult mind states that arise with compassion, with care. We can care for the heart in each of us that is wounded, that's brutalized, when we are in touch with this senseless violence, this unjust, inhumane violence happening in so many places. So the Dharma has this quality of helping us to compost these states of suffering, to work with them, to see them as workable, as fertile ground, right? When suffering arises, if we can bring mindfulness, if we can bring interest, if we can bring an open heart of care, of friendliness to that suffering, the whole situation changes. Okay? And when we put ourselves in communities like this one, the Sangha, the community of practice, carries within itself the Buddha. And that is healing, that is transforming, that is composting our suffering just when we sit in a group like this. We may not even need to do anything, but just show up and let the collective energy massage our heart, our mind, our pain, our joy. So I was sharing in a group recently about the power of gratitude. I actually started out that talk in a very bad mood. I don't know what was going on, but I was like, oh, I'm in a bad place. I can't give a good teaching. And that Sangha transformed me in the process of offering the teaching. So don't think I'm sitting here offering something to you. We are each offering something to each other. And I've experienced that on numerous occasions when I've been in whatever kind of jumbled up or irritable or somehow grumpy state, and I've showed up just to teach or to be part of a group, and that group has helped me to see how impermanent and how mutable our mind states are. And the Dharma has this very healing, very uplifting effect, sometimes much faster than you would think, than you would expect. So and I thought, wow, I have to talk about gratitude. I don't feel I'm not in touch with this at all. But then the group was so present, and it was a beautiful evening, it turned out. And in the question and answers, someone asked, how do you practice gratitude when you're struggling, when things are challenging? And that's what I shared about how multiple realities can exist in any moment. That things can be difficult, that is true, that things are difficult, and it's also true that the earth is always holding us in any given moment. The earth is there. We are being supported by the earth. The sun is always shining, whether it's night or day. The sun is shining. The sun is there for us. And so this is this capacity to widen out our perspective. We need to be able to zoom in and care for acute experiences, our disappointment, our pain. We need to be able to be very intimate with them and get close to them. But we also need this capacity to take in the bigger picture, what's happening beyond our individual experience of pain or confusion. And that's what that means, taking in multiple realities, not just our own experience right in that moment. To be able to touch that life is supporting us, that other beings are supporting us, right? To tap into gratitude. And so I listened to a podcast called For the Wilds. It's like a climate change podcast. It was a replay of an interview done with Dr. Bayo Akomolafe from 2020. And at the very end, they were talking about how sometimes there are just no answers, and questions are the most generative things that we can sit with. And then Bayo told the story from the book of Job in the Old Testament. So Job was this upstanding spiritual practitioner who did everything right. He was wealthy, he had children, he followed all the rules, he had all of his cows. And then suddenly, in one day, everything got taken from him. His children died, his cows were taken from him, all of his land. And he was in such distress. He didn't understand why something so horrible would happen to him when he had done everything right. And his friends told him, you should curse God. But he wanted to ask God why this was happening to him. And so he had the chance to ask God, why is this happening? And in the story, God responds to him, not directly to his question. Bayo says God responds like a politician, right, when asked a direct question. God says, Job, have you paid attention to the amazing things I have created? Like the volcanoes, like, this is paraphrasing, right? But like, the butterfly's wings and the structure of DNA, to the exquisite radiance of the rainbow and the sunset and the colors, the beauty. So it's one of these answers that's like an invitation, like a koan, to widen out, to take in all that's happening in the world that is magnificent, which is also true. Yes, the suffering is true, And this intense well-being and beauty and mystery is also true. It's not spiritual bypassing to say, I'm not going to pay attention to this hard stuff. I'm just going to focus on the good stuff. But it's being able to see the foreground and the background together. Because when we get in touch with the wholeness of life, that actually supports us to care for the suffering in the foreground. When we nourish ourselves with what is well, that beautiful Negro spiritual, it is well with my soul. When we touch it, when we get in touch with what is well with our souls, we have more strength to take care of what is not well with our souls. So it's not about skipping over something so we can run away from it. It's about taking in, gathering up strength, gathering up perspective, gathering up inspiration so that we can hold what's so hard to hold with more spaciousness, with more at our disposal, more wisdom. So I want to just share a couple more stories that have inspired me recently of this practice. And one of them refers to suicide, so thoughts of suicide. So I just want to name that at the outset. So I read a book recently it's a memoir of a young woman who escaped from South Sudan during the civil war there. She was 6 and she traveled on foot from all through South Sudan to Kenya and was raised in a refugee camp, separated from her parents. Her caretakers were killed, and it was a very traumatic experience, and not having clean water, not having food, and getting ill. So she manages to survive and this very dangerous escape, and she lives for 10 years in this Kenyan refugee camp and gets reunited with an uncle and some other relatives. And it's a very beautiful, touching story. That the title of the book is Don't Look Back, and the author is Achut, A-C-H-U-T, Achut Deng, D-E-N-G. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But she talks about, the lost boys of Sudan, which were the US, other countries gave asylum to some thousands of young boys who were in refugee camps from Sudan, but there were hundreds of girls within those thousands of boys, and she was one of the girls who was brought to, I think it was Dallas or Houston, I can't remember, it was in Texas, and she's so relieved to be in the US, and then the safety she thought she was going to find ends up not being safe at all. And the people who are, one person who is supposed to be protecting her doesn't protect her. And so she has this moment of contemplating taking her own life at age 16. And what comes up in her mind is remembering her grandmother's words to her as they were running from the rebel forces that were attacking her people, and how strong her grandmother was and how her grandmother transmitted her strength to her. Her last words to her were, "You are strong. You are strong." And then her mother's friend who found her and helped her, escape from Sudan to Kenya, she fought so hard to keep her alive, to keep her protected. She just loved her unconditionally. And she thought of that friend of her mother's who sacrificed so much for her. And then she realized she loved life enough to endure that difficult situation she was in. And she made it through this really intense moment of wanting to end her life by widening out to take in the multiple realities that were true. She also was a very strong person who had endured a lot, who had the trust and the, we have in the 5 awarenesses of Plum Village, these awarenesses of our ancestors and our descendants in us, and that their expectations are, we have to be aware of them, right? So that's her moment of awareness of like, wait a minute, I can't end my life because I'm a continuation of my ancestors. They have done so much to love me and support me. I want to honor them. That was basically her awareness. I want to honor them. And she was able to make it through a really difficult time. And fortunately, she was able to, soon after that, live in another place where she was actually safe. And she reunites with her parents finally many years later. It's a very beautiful story if you have a chance to read Don't Look Back by Ashut Deng. But that moment of her contemplating suicide was such a powerful experience of her being able to tap into other realities in herself and in the world around her that was bigger than that experience of despair, right? That experience of such overwhelm. Two more stories I'll share briefly. One is, I have a friend who I met when I was living overseas. And this friend is also from a country in East Africa, who was basically leaving that country for political asylum reasons, for his own safety. And he didn't have all the paperwork he needed, and so he was put in jail in this country he was just trying to pass through in order to join his family in the West. So he was in jail for some 2 years, and then a young lawyer was able to help him get asylum in that country, proving that he had left his country for safety reasons. So he was able to live as a refugee in this country, and that's how we met, and we became friends. And this is someone who fell in love. His fiance came over, they got married, they had a baby. She had to go back to the US. He still hasn't seen his son. His son is 2 years old almost. and they were just waiting for him to be able to come back to to be able to come to the US. And he, in spite of so many hardships, is so full of life and full of love, and he is doing anything he can to help other refugees. He's translating books that he feels inspired by. He's Catholic, so he translates spiritual books into his language of his people. He wrote a book of poetry for his parents when they had their 50th wedding anniversary. He's a poet. I always feel so happy when I talk to him. I mean, I think if I were in his situation, I don't know that I could be so content and hopeful, and he's just taking good care of the present moment and loving and caring for the people around him. And he talks to his wife and son every day. But there are people in the world who are living in these situations of great, you could say, injustice, of great deprivation. And he keeps that zoom widened perspective somehow, so that he is not hopeless, not draining his energy, right? And since it's close to the time now, I'll just tell you, if you can watch the movie Father Stew, it's such a beautiful story about someone who is very in a lot of difficulty, inner and outer. And he is not your typical Catholic priest material, but somehow he finds his way. He has so much transformation. He becomes a Catholic priest. I'll just say that much. But he becomes someone who is so, in the beginning of the film, he's so consumed by his own suffering that he really, he's doesn't have a way to help himself, let alone help others. By the end of the movie, he is so transformed. Many people come to him for support, and he has so transformed his suffering that he is just a light for all these people. In spite of the intense suffering he still has to endure physically. So, very beautiful, very spiritual film, Father Stew, S-T-U. So I will stop there, and thank you for your kind attention.